let's put the finishing touches on the cognitive psychology course with our last topic, social cognition. Now, we might think, hey, isn't this supposed to be a topic for social psychology? And yeah, sure, okay. But of course, like many areas of psychology, we have a lot of overlap between these different little subfields or domains, and that's perfectly fine. And certainly it is the case that when we think of social psychology, there's a whole lot of other stuff that we might also talk about besides what we'll call here social cognition. So let's kind of drill in a little bit on what exactly this is. Well, it relates primarily to right here, right? What do we think about other people? How do we think about other people is the real question here. So what we're really getting at here is the idea that well, let me back up. A lot of times a corollary term that goes with social cognition is social perception. And we could talk about that here too as well. Social perception means that literally I'm just observing other people in a social context. I'm seeing their behavior. I see what they do. Social cognition then is the corollary to this, which is now that I've observed somebody doing something, the question I have for myself is why, right? What's that person doing and why are they doing it? Are they doing this because of some reason, some goal that they have, some motivation? What are they feeling? Is there an emotion that they're experiencing that is explaining their behavior? Obviously, we can read their expressions a little bit. But this idea, of course, means, it relates to the basic idea that we can't really read other people's minds. We don't really know what they're thinking. And so while I can potentially directly perceive their actions, the argument here is that what I need to do is I need to take what I have observed from their actions and then use that to infer what it is that they might be thinking, right? To try to understand why people do what they do. And the term for this here is called mentalizing, right? So we are mentalizing others. What does that mean? It just means maybe what it sounds like, that we are attributing mind or mentality to another person's behavior. So if I'm watching, for example, a tree branch blowing in the wind or the leaves falling from the tree in the autumn, I don't necessarily attribute mind to that. So I'm not mentalizing the tree. I could do this, of course, and this is what's commonly referred to as magical thinking, that I might have a tendency to anthropomorphize nature and to do all this kind of stuff. So that's potentially a form of mentalizing as well, but we're not really going to engage in the magical thinking side of things here. The argument is that when I mentalize other people, that's not magical thinking because it is correct in a way to assume that other people have minds. We justify this, of course, by saying that even though I can't really read other people's minds, I can effectively understand other people's minds because I have one myself. And it is an accurate and justified inference to draw to assume that other people's behavior is guided by some similar underlying mental processes that also explain my own behavior. If that's not true, the entire enterprise of experimental psychology and cognitive psychology is going to fall apart here. So we can assume that we can justify these sorts of claims. Right. So the next question, though, is, of course, what is the nature of this mentalizing process, right? How does it work? And this is our first explanation of it is called theory of mind. This is potentially a confusing term. If you've heard it before, you might be familiar with what it is. If you've never heard it before, you might be a little thrown off by this phrase, theory of mind. Because when you first see the phrase, you think, oh, this is a theory that defines what mind is, right? Like it's some kind of psychological theory about mind. Well, no, theory of mind is meant to describe our own internal naive theories about the minds of other people. And this has its origins in Piaget, who, by the way, did talk about magical thinking, or animistic thinking is also known here, in early childhood. So what Piaget notes is that when children are going through their developmental phases, they develop their schemas, right? And I think we've talked about schemas before. So Now, they develop all kinds of different schemas about the way the world works, but part of their schemas would be things related to their social world and the behavior of other people. And one of the things that they might start to do is they develop a schema of mind or a theory of mind, which is their own individual personal understanding of what minds are. And minds have various characteristics. One characteristic, of course, is that, as noted, they are private. I can't read other people's minds. And so that means that there could be a lot of thoughts and stuff happening inside the mind of another person that I don't know about. What goes along with that is that that means that there's a lot of things going on in my mind that are also private to me and that other people don't necessarily know about. The question here is how do children understand this? Do children understand the privacy of mental experience? And not always, right? Because one of the things that you might sometimes see is that a child will start to make certain assumptions that because they know something, that means everyone else knows something as well or knows that same thing. One example of that is that if a child who maybe is alone in their room and they do something wrong, they break something, they're doing something they're not supposed to do. As soon as they do that wrong thing, they immediately feel really guilty and they go running crying to mom or dad to say, I'm sorry, don't be mad or whatever. As if now that the child knows they've done wrong, they assume that the parents automatically know this too, right? They've separated or they failed to separate their own knowledge of the situation from what their parents would likely be able to know. So that shows some, difficulty with the boundary between the privacy of their own first person experience and what other people know versus what they don't know. Of course, another part of the formation of this theory of mind in children is this magical thinking, so that the children start to say, okay, if I have mind and other people have minds, then I can start to attribute mind to other things. And maybe that means I'm going to attribute mind to my toys. That's a common thing to see, that children might mentalize their dolls. Um, they mentalize other animals, especially their pets. That may or may not be fair. Of course, that's a debatable thing. It probably is so fair, of course, but the level of mentalization that we might attribute to our pet dogs and cats or fish might be, very different than the reality, at least, of course. So Piaget is claiming that there is a developmental process that children are going through as they develop this so-called schema of mind or theory of mind, and it improves gradually over time. This is referred to also, and here's another confusing term, theory. So that means that we're talking about theories about theory of mind, and so according to Piaget's theory, theory of mind takes the form of a internalized schema about how we understand minds and ourselves and in other people. As a common way of understanding children's ability to perform, or I should say, as a way of understanding children's cognitive abilities, Piaget and then later others developed a variety of different cognitive tests that measure their cognitive abilities. What we know as the Sally Ann test is one example. This is not something Piaget invented, but it came along, a bit later. It's a category. It's part of a category of tests called false belief tasks. And the idea of a false belief task is it's possible that other people don't know things, right? So I know something to be true, but somebody else does not know this to be true. And that means that this other person has a false belief. And I can separate my knowledge of the truth versus some other person's lack of that knowledge. And that's a form of theory of mind. And so the Sally Ann test is a way of doing that here. So let's see if my little video will play inside of here like this. 42-month-old failing the test. So let's see what's going on here.
This is Sally and Ann's basket and box. And one day, Sally and Ann were playing with a block in their house. And then Sally decided to put the block in the box. And then she decided to go outside and play where she couldn't see or hear anything, right? Hey. Now, that tricky Ann decided to take the block and put it in the basket. Now, since Sally is outside, did she see Anne move the block? No, she didn't, did she?
I'm going to pause it right there. So what we are seeing here is the establishment of a false belief, right, in Sally. Sally cannot and should not know that her toy has been moved, and the child has acknowledged this, right? She doesn't know.
So, what does she think the block is? She think it's in there. Why don't she think it's in there? Why? It's in there.
But then we see immediately that even though the child acknowledges that Sally didn't see it, the toy being moved, when the child is asked, where will Sally think the block is? She points to the basket because it's in there. So the child knows that this is where the object really is and is failing to separate her own personal knowledge from what Sally ought to know. And it gives an incorrect answer here, right? Because there is no way for Sally to know. So we would expect her to come and look in the box, not the basket. She's about 3.5 years old, right? I think that was the age given there. So now we have a child who's a little bit over 4 years, sorry. And let's see how this child deals with the same scenario.
And these are Sally's basket, Anne and Sally's basket and box. And guess what? One day, Anne and Sally were playing with a block in the house. And then Sally decided to put the block inside the box. And then Sally decided to go outside and play, where she couldn't see or hear anything that was happening inside. Bye, Sally. Well, that tricky Anne, guess what she did? She took it out of the box. She took the block and put it in the basket. Now, did Sally see Anne move the block? No. That's right. That's right. She didn't see.
So once again, we ask the child, we get the same scenario, the same setup. We ask this child, did Sally see any of this happen? Does she know? He again acknowledges no. But
so when Sally comes in, what do you think the block is? So she'll think it's in the box. Why do you?
yeah, so he gets it correct here. So a developmental milestone has occurred somewhere in this, range of ages here from 3.5 to about 4.5 years of age. Of course, that's going to differ from child to child. The age is not super critical here, but we're seeing that during these early childhood years, the ability to perform on these kinds of tests is developing and it's improving. And this would suggest that what the part of cognition that is doing the improving is the cognitive theory stuff, right? The child's ability to infer knowledge and mental states in these other characters here, right? It's a doll, of course, but the children are kind of assumed to be able to understand that the dolls represent characters that could be real people, and they are kind of developing this kind of mentalizing of the characters here. We have another example here. Let me just talk about it real quick. The reading the mind in the eyes test. So again, it's a measure of, understanding emotional states in others based on facial expression. So our ability to do that, empathy, of course, would be under the broader umbrella of theory of mind as well. Now, one thing I want to say about the Sally Ann test that might be worth noting is we noticed that this older child in the second part of the video, he guessed the end a little bit, right? As soon as the experimenter said that tricky Anne, he I think was clued in that she's going to move the toy to a new location, and he kind of gets it even before we get to the end, right? And it might be worth asking another question here. Because this is a little story that we're telling these children, we're acting out the story with the dolls and the props, but it's still a story, and that means that in addition to needing theory of mind to function well in this situation, we might also need working memory and the ability to follow a narrative, because part of a story is that you're going to have sort of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that when you get to the end, you're going to need to be able to integrate how the story ends with what happened at the beginning and the middle, right? And so it's sometimes underappreciated how much working memory is necessary to follow the narrative of a story. Just like thinking about, watching a movie where sometimes the plot gets too convoluted and you can't remember all the little details and you start to lose the plot, right? In a situation like this, it might be that what's happening is that that younger child who failed the test could have failed it not because she lacks an appropriate understanding of mindfulness in others, but it might rather be because she's just not mature enough to have enough memory resources to follow along with the story. And I say that because we see the older child doing so well at following along with the story that he's kind of guessing the end before he's even told the end, right? He's got the narrative down. He knows what's happening. And so it might be more of a memory and narrative following sort of task. That could mean that as a measure of theory of mind, this might have some problematic validity. Another reason why I mention that is that there's been a paper out. I don't think it's ever been peer reviewed and published, but it's in an archive site um, called Theory of Mind may have spontaneously emerged in large language models, aka AIs like ChatGPT. And what the researcher did was he used uh, text-based versions of measurements like the Sally Ann test. So you can try this yourself. Just open up any LLM that you want to use and give it a version of the Sally Ann test, right? Explain it in words, in your own words, right? The whole situation, and then ask it, where will Sally look for her toy when she returns to the room? And you should find that ChatGPT, Claude, and all these others will pass the test, right? And so that would then suggest that maybe these kinds of AIs have acquired theory of mind because they can pass the test. And that might be true, but personally, I don't think it is, because that would be attributing mind to these AIs. And I don't think it's correct to say that they have minds. Rather, what's happening is that the AIs have developed some understanding of the narrative and the story, and they're able to understand the details of the story, and to the extent that they can detect the pattern and give us an appropriate answer. And that could be another way of thinking about child development here, is that they understand the pattern in the narrative and they can predict the outcome given the pattern that as it unfolds throughout the course of this little story. Now, we'll set that aside because I don't think we need to really, keep diving into that. But it's worth a note, of course, that that these tests maybe are not always everything they're cracked up to be. A couple other things to say about theory of mind. Separate from theory, we also have simulation theory, which makes the claim that when we are trying to mentalize others, what we're really doing is we're running a kind of an internal simulation of that behavior, like putting ourselves into that person's shoes and imagining why, if we were doing the same thing, why would we do it? And once we develop an understanding of why we would do that, then we use that to make an attribution about the other person. There's also modularity theory. I don't think that we need to consider modularity theory as an alternative theory of mind theory, like simulation or theory, but rather it's one that focuses more on the neuroscience. It wants to point to the idea that there are these dedicated modules in the brain, namely the temporoparietal junction and the medial prefrontal cortex, involved in theory of mind tasks, mentalizing tasks. But there's also some concern over this, because what we also find is that these two parts of the brain, plus a few other parts of the brain, are also part of something called the default mode network. And the default mode network is not really a module per se, right? It's an assortment and a collection of various different regions of the brain that are all connected as part of a system and a network, really, rather than a single isolated module somewhere in the brain. And the default mode network, in its original formulation, was thought to be something of a like default resting state for the brain when we're not engaged in a task. And then it started to move into, okay, well, when we're not engaged into a task, what happens is our mind is wandering. And so if I'm like, let's say you're studying and so you're really engaged in some sort of task relevant network here, And then you get bored and tired and your mind starts to wander, and that's when the default mode network takes over. But what we've also learned since then is that the nature of this mind wandering behavior is oftentimes self-referential. You're thinking about yourself, you're thinking about the past, you might also even be thinking about other people. And this idea, again, with simulation theory, that thinking about ourselves is relevant to thinking about others, would suggest then that the default mode network is really very much a social network here, right? And the same idea that thinking about ourselves and thinking about others are all intimately bound up in the brain using a lot of the same interconnected systems. This also, by the way, then is reflected in research with what are called mirror neurons. These are areas of the brain that neurons, specifically groups of neurons that are active when we are performing a task. So we would expect to find them in premotor regions, right, that are involved in our performance of the task. But they are also found in some sensory areas of the brain. And the idea is that they are not just active when we ourselves perform a certain behavior, like waving or shaking hands or whatever it might be. Notice those are social behaviors, but they're also active when we observe other people performing those same actions. So again, it suggests that the connection between us performing actions and other people performing actions and how that's reflected in the same parts of the brain is consistent with this idea that the self-referential thinking and the other referential thinking are very much connected as brain regions here. Okay, so we're going to move on to some standard research in social psychology about making judgments of others, but I think for now this is a good place to stop. So we'll go ahead and stop it here, and then we will pick up with some of this kind of applied social psychology for the next part.